Welcome to the Titans of Industry show. We have a great show lined up for everyone today, and with some very timely questions. So with me is a first-time guest who is an extremely popular guest on many YouTube shows, Mr. Rob Kirby. It's KirbyAnalytics.com. Many important topics to touch upon today, so let's jump right into it. First of all, Rob, thanks for coming on the show.
Pleasure to make the acquaintance, Lior.
Yeah, look, I want to ask you first. Did you listen to the full Donald Trump speech at the U.S. At the UN Assembly?
I listened to bits and pieces of it, but I can't say I necessarily heard the whole thing.
What do you think about it?
What do I think about it? I mean, my general overall opinion of Donald Trump is that he's trying to do the right thing for his country. Is he brash and is he rough around the edges at times? At times, yes. But I think the situation financially that America finds itself in today requires let's just say maybe a street fighter to try to have a meaningful impact for the betterment of America's financial state, which I think is severely worse than what is commonly and fed to the public through the mainstream financial press.
Now, I've listened to the entire speech, and what I have to say is that immediately after I listened to reactions from the mainstream media, and even a child, even if you give like a 5-year-old the task of seeing is there a problem with how these mainstream outlets report on what they heard, even he can pick up that there is just a blatant and deliberate agenda to just take things out of context. Now, I've never, I don't listen to mainstream media at all, so this was just a test that I wanted to run to see this in action, because I don't, it's not part of my routine to sit down and listen to CNN or CNBC or Fox, etc. I've never done that, and so this was just my first taste of that, and it was amazing, because even if you know nothing about these channels and know nothing about the background and what people say about them, it's so obvious. And it's a very unique phenomenon, and therefore I want to ask you, in his speech, one of the first things he kind of mentioned was that the stock market was at all-time highs, and small business environment is very successful right now. There's a lot of optimism. The African American community, in terms of their employment, it's their biggest participation level in the United States history. He cited all of these great things that are happening with the U.S. economy, and I want to ask you, how much do you attribute those records and successes that he's mentioning with this administration's policies, and how much do you just credit to plain good old timing and fluke, coincidence?
I don't think the employment data as it's being presented is a fluke by any stretch of the imagination. That being said, I don't necessarily believe the actual numbers themselves. But is America and American employment prospects better today than prior to Trump's swearing in? I don't think you can argue otherwise. What has happened with Trump's America First policies, we've seen the reopening and the rekindling and the recommitment of American-based business to open more branches and outlets and factories in America, thereby putting more blue-collar Americans, good-paying blue-collar jobs. Absolutely, more people have been put back to work. And but as per the overall reporting of U.S. government statistics, I would refer people to the work of John Williams of shadowstats.com, who tells us basically, in a nutshell, that government reporting over the years has become very suspect. For example, when measuring inflation, the means by which inflation is measured has changed dramatically over the years, and it's Williams' work, who's a brilliant guy with numbers, a brilliant accountant, I believe an accountant, but he's a really smart guy. He reverse engineers the way inflation data is measured today, and what he'll express is that if you measure inflation the way it was measured in 1980, when inflation was supposedly a big problem, if we're to measure it the same way today as it was measured then, instead of inflation being 2%, inflation would be 10%. And so what's happened over the years is we've seen hedonic, the adjustments they make to the measurement of inflation. They refer to it as hedonic adjustments. And to give you an example of what a hedonic adjustment would be, they would take, for instance, a car that's built today with a lot of bells and whistles and GPS and things that didn't exist in 1980. And so a car today that cost $50,000 might have only cost $20,000 in 1980, but because it has all these supposed improvements, it really hasn't gone up in price at all.
They're claiming essentially that the price changed because there's value added and not because the price inflated.
Not because the price went up or the dollars are buying less.
Sure. Now I want to ask you. Look, we've seen from 2009 to 2018, we've seen the recovery. Obviously, the recovery has been in pockets in certain areas and certain factions of society. The people that have financial assets or real estate holdings, they've seen the recovery all the way back to 2011. Most of the upper middle class and the wealthy in America and abroad have gone back to pre-crisis wealth and net worth back in 2011 or 2012. The rest of the population, it came in waves, but for many Americans, many millions of Americans, they don't even understand what the mainstream media or the alternative media reports when they say that there's a recovery. But on the flip side, we are seeing as close to peak capacity, fat margins, record guidance profits. So this is as good as this cycle gets. What will happen to many millions of Americans and people worldwide, either on fixed income or minimum wage, and many other problems? And as you talked about, they do measure unemployment in a very funny way in America. So if you've given up on work, you don't get classified as unemployed anymore, which obviously makes the entire situation fuzzy, because the participation rate in America is about 65% right now. So we have a situation where it's where a third of the country is not working, yet you have 4% unemployment. So I definitely understand you in that regard. I want to ask you, what are some of the problematic areas that you see with the U.S. economy that trouble you the most, that you think about most as an immediate, imminent threat?
Well, you just hit the nail on the head for one of them. The labor force participation rates of around 65% are very close to historic low participation rates. So while it's very easy to trumpet record low unemployment rates, when you've changed the methodology and how you measure who an unemployed person is, or what the definition of an unemployed person is, you've got to question the credulity of the measurement. It's sort of like, you see, I like to explain to people when they lie about the inflation data. the means in which they do this is they change the benchmark. And it's sort of like if you can imagine being on an American football field, standing on the 20-yard line to kick a field goal, and you're standing on the line and you can see the number 20, but then if I move the goalpost back 20 yards, do you really believe you're still kicking a 20-yard field goal? You know, I guess you're still standing on the 20, but you have to kick twice as hard because you're now got to kick the ball 40 yards to get it through the uprights. So when you distort benchmarks, you create a false sense, or I refer to it as happy juice. You make people, or you give people a false sense of security that things are better than they really are.
Sure. Now let me ask you, in light of this, Rob, this wealth gap, it's the biggest that the United States has seen post World War II. So the United States enjoyed this miracle called a prospering middle class, where people were employed. One person per family was employed, and still you can afford a house, you can afford a lifestyle, you get to retire. And obviously, with Japan and Europe, rehabilitating after the war, by the 60s, 70s, this game was over, and the middle class of America started to shrink. By 2022, there will be essentially no middle class in the United States the way it used to be.
Sure, Lior. But what's happened? Listen, the middle class in America has been hollowed out. See, the middle class jobs in America, this was a conscious decision by the leaders of industry in America to outsource good-paying American jobs. They were outsourced, and I don't even like to use the word outsourcing. Basically, what they were engaged in, it was labor arbitrage. Corporations and managers of corporations, with their eyes on nothing but quarterly profits, figured that they could boost their bottom line and get a bigger bonus if they got rid of production in a jurisdiction where people were earning $30 or $40 an hour, and moved it to China, where people make $1 a day.
Sure, and in light of this, this is completely where I'm going with the question. I want to ask you, come the next election cycle, which should coincide with some sort of a slowdown in the economy, maybe a severe slowdown, maybe even a recession, what do you see as the probability of a genuine revolt between the haves and have-nots? Is the opportunity gap, which makes people think that capitalism in America is just not right for them, that they can't prosper inside the system, that it's not a land of opportunity anymore? What do you think will happen in the next election cycle with this regard? Do you see this nation as divided, where there will be a problem to even find common grounds, and a solution will be much prolonged just because the players involved can't reach any decision?
Well, I don't think we're going to have to wait till the next presidential election cycle. I think the writing's going to be all over the wall as soon as midterm elections, which start in about what are they? We're 6 weeks away, and if the Democrats regain the House and the Senate, I believe that Donald Trump will be impeached. Whether there's a basis or grounds for impeaching him is irrelevant, because the Democrats, to me, the Democrats resemble nothing more than a bunch of lunatics with their hair on fire. These are people that are trying to march America towards communism, socialism/communism at breakneck pace. And anyone who wants to stop and think about how that story ends might want to consider countries where socialism/communism and how it's fared. So at the end of the Second World War, we saw Germany divided. We saw it divided into a capitalist country and a communist country. East and West Germany. Who do you think did better? Another country where the same thing happened, the Koreas. North Korea communist, South Korea capitalist. Who do you think did better there? The Soviet Union was completely communist and socialist, and how did that experiment work out there? Venezuela is another great example. How has it worked out there? How did communism work out in Cuba? Why are Cubans dying to get out of there and come to America? Can anyone name one jurisdiction on this planet where communism has had a happy ending?
Sure, and obviously people who study communism know that the system just consumes itself and it destroys itself. It cannot work.
So Lior, while capitalism might have its shortcomings, it generally produces a better living standard and I'm going to just suggest a general feeling of empowerment and rising fortunes, much more so than this hellish path that the Democrats would have us go down.
Okay. Now, you have uncovered a $21 trillion audit death sentence, basically, for the government, and it triggered the end of sort of the end of American transparency of government. Can you update everyone on the story?
Well, it wasn't myself who discovered this. The people that are behind these revelations are very credible people. The esteemed PhD economist from Michigan State University and his research staff, Dr. Mark Skidmore, along with Catherine Austin Fitts, former Undersecretary of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, in the Bush 1 administration. And they forensically examined U.S. government data between the years 1998 and 2015, and they discovered that there were $21 trillion worth of unaccounted for adjustments to the books. So $21 trillion basically was on their books, and they don't know where it's gone, who has it, and what's become of it. And when this was made public in December of last year, the White House, a week later, ordered a complete audit of the Department of Defense. And Catherine Fitts has reported, late August, that this whole affair has now been deemed to be by the U.S. government of national security importance, and have classified the whole issue, which basically means that there will be no transparency, there will be no reasons or explanations given to what has become of this 21 trillion, and effectively it means the end of accounting, period, for the U.S. government. So that's the elevator version of what has transpired in the last 8 months in U.S. government books.
And it's not the first time. I remember even going back to Rumsfeld that he couldn't account for billions and billions and trillions, and was even asked and
2 trillion that Rumsfeld, and understand that when Rumsfeld made this admission, it was the day before 9/11. So on September 10th, 2001, Rumsfeld admitted that the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, could not account for $2 trillion or 1.9 trillion. And then, of course, on 9/11, the alleged plane that flew into the Pentagon flew into the exact area of the Pentagon, the exact office where all of the books were being kept on their finances.
it's a nice bedtime story for people who believe in one copy, in one that the government keeps one copy of these things.
Oh yes. Oh, now the records are all gone.
Yeah. Oh man. The U.S. government has quite a bit of stories to tell the public. Sometimes it baffles me why people believe these stories. I want to ask you, lastly, yesterday the Fed hiked interest rates again, and this is a situation now where the U.S. dollar or the Treasury debt is paying much higher interest rates than the rest of the world, and it changes what's going on with the demand for U.S. debt. But as the Fed continues to shrink its balance sheet and allow billions of dollars of bonds to mature, and they're not buying them again or buying any bonds for that matter, in about a year and a half to 2 years at this trajectory, when the federal government will want to raise debt again to pay for ever-growing obligations, such as the Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, income security, defense, etc., the biggest items on the budget, and obviously the interest on existing debt, they will find that they have a shortage of buyers at these interest levels. Now, could we see a situation where the Fed is desperate enough to create policies that are even more inflationary than QE, than outright going and buying bonds, and actually just outright printing currency?
Well, you see, Lior, a few minutes ago we were talking about 21 trillion missing dollars. These are dollars that were created. I refer to them as off-book dollars. And these dollars were created, and it's my belief that these dollars are hiding in entities that do not provide any transparency or do not have any disclosure, like the Exchange Stabilization Fund. And the Exchange Stabilization Fund, to give your listeners just a quick background, was created in 1934. Its mission statement was to perpetuate the use of the U.S. dollar as a primary instrument in the settlement of international trade. And where it got its heft from, it arose from the confiscation of America's citizens' gold. All the gold in America that was in circulation in gold coin form was confiscated, and people were compensated when they were confiscated to the tune of $20 an ounce for their gold back in 1934. And 6 months after the confiscation, the U.S. government revalued the gold up to $35. That created a $3 billion windfall profit. That $3 billion was used to seed the Exchange Stabilization Fund. The Exchange Stabilization Fund is an adjunct of the U.S. Treasury. It does not publish financials. It is not subject to any laws, and it is accountable to nobody. There is no congressional oversight over the Exchange Stabilization Fund, and it's operated at the pleasure of the Secretary of the Treasury. And through the years, it's been engaged in everything from drug running, arms dealing, regime change, and anything, murder for hire, and its muscle or its let's just say its enforcement arm is typically the U.S. intelligence agency. And if you'd like to gain a bigger understanding about what the ESF and the dirty crap that it's involved in, you might want to go to a site called marketskeptics.com. And it's a site that was created by a chap, I'm just having trouble with his name at the moment, Eric DeCarbonell, sorry. And if you go to the homepage of marketskeptics.com, if you look in the right-hand column, you will see an entry, something that I've been afraid to blog about. And what it is, if you click on that link, it'll take you to a 5-part YouTube expose on the creation and the inner workings of the Exchange Stabilization Fund. So the 21 trillion that's missing, that is unaccounted for, in my view, is hiding in an entity, if not entirely in entities like the Exchange Stabilization Fund. And what this money is used for is to this is basically a black box resource that the powers that be have at their disposal to effectively alter the outcomes in what would normally occur in freely trading capital markets. So when you speak of will the U.S. government ever have a problem with finding enough buyers for their debt, I would only mention to you that in the last year the U.S. government has added $1.4 trillion in new debt to their existing debt pile, and their traditional financiers, namely China, Japan, Russia to a much lesser extent, but these traditional financiers have purchased none of the new debt. And the question really, in my mind, the question that should be asked, who's buying the debt? Who's buying all this new debt? Because China certainly isn't. Japan isn't. The Russians aren't. They're actually net sellers. And yet, the dollar remains strong, even though the traditional financiers are dumping the debt. And the real reality is the Fed may be raising short-term interest rates, but I mean, I look at the 10-year yield this morning, and as we speak, it's 306. I mean, the 10-year bond's been at 306, was at 306 briefly, I think, 2.5 years ago. And what I can tell you is that 1 year ago, the 10-year bond was yielding roughly 235, and today we're at, call it 306, or even just say 305. So we've seen the 10-year bond in 1 year go up 70 basis points, which is close to, which basically means that bonds people held a year ago are worth almost 30% less today than they were a year ago. And a 30% haircut on 1.4 trillion would equate to about a $450 billion haircut. I haven't heard of anyone taking any big haircuts, let alone a $450 billion haircut. But the reality is, somewhere, something, or somebody is sitting on a very, very nasty loss. And I would contend that loss is just a part of doing business, and it's buried in the black box of the Exchange Stabilization Fund. But they didn't pay. But Lior, they didn't pay anything to create the money. The money was fraudulently created. But basically, what I'm saying, I'm accusing the U.S. government and the U.S. Treasury of basically memory holding their own debt. They're monetizing their own debt, and it may be very true that the Fed has stopped QE years ago, but the U.S. Treasury is not the Fed. I believe the U.S. Treasury is engaged in outright monetization of debt, and it's a complete fraud that's being perpetrated not only on the American people. This is a complete fraud, probably the biggest financial fraud ever perpetrated on humanity, and it's being perpetrated on the whole world because the dollar to this date remains the world's reserve currency.
Rob, very, very interesting stuff. Where can people check out more of your work?
They can catch me on the web at kirbyanalytics.com.
KirbyAnalytics.com. Beautiful. Thank you for coming on the show. You've certainly raised very, very important topics, which I assume more Americans have to know about, because the ramifications of some of these things are just enormous to everyday life.
Well, Lior, the reality is the rest of the world is increasingly becoming aware that this is indeed the case, and this is what's really at the root of all of the let's just say the friction in the world. It's at the root of all problems. The money is bad, and the stewardship of the world's reserve currency has been exercised in an extremely poor fashion, criminally.
The world reserve currency is certainly both a privilege and a curse, and it needs to be used in the right way. And you put it in the wrong hands, and you get a 21.5 trillion worth of federal debt. I mean, it's insane. And if you go to us.debtclock.org, which I assume many of our listeners know about, it's just a real-time clock that counts all of these measures for the U.S. government.
No, it only counts the debt we know about.
Sure, obviously. Rob, thank you very much for being here. Thanks.
It's been a pleasure.